Alright, this is the first of 7 videos on the civil rights movement. Now, this first video is complete review. We've already talked about everything here, early issues, post-Reconstruction, all the way to World War I. The second video, half of it will be there, and I'm doing this so we have a complete timeline and we can talk about all these things occurring. Okay, so here we go with the first video. And one of the first things is, following the Civil War, as we talked, in 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed. The 13th Amendment officially freed the slaves. Remember, Lincoln does not have the power to do this. I'm going to move a little quick on most of these because we've talked about these. But the 13th Amendment did free the slaves, so now we have this mass group of people who used to be slaves, now free, but we don't really know what they're supposed to be able to do. Also in 1865, we start to see the emergence of the KKK. This was due to the fact that they're going to end Reconstruction, and the KKK is there to put these people back in their place. Because we find out through the 13th Amendment and all the things, they're not technically citizens, they're just freed people. So they don't have any rights. The Freedmen's Bureau was organized in order to help these former freed slaves, hence freedmen's, get the help and get the training and supplies that they will need to be productive citizens in the South. However, a lot of people see it as you can see in the picture here, of somebody expecting a handout and helping, and them not doing much of an effort. All right. Now, also in 1865, we have the establishment of black codes. This goes back to the KKK, Freedmen's Bureau. They can't vote, can't join the military, can't testify. Different states have different rules, and some actually ban blacks from the states. So the black codes, a code is kind of an unwritten law. There's no like jail time, etc., but they can be enforced. So a lot of people are really upset about the way the black codes are working, and in class we'll actually look at a couple of these black codes and we can kind of run through them and see how we feel. Now, 1868, Congress sets out to kind of rectify all these problems we're seeing in the South, and they'll pass the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the second due process, and the big wording is equal protection under the law. Basically, the freed slaves are now citizens. They have equal protection, meaning they have due process rights, they have habeas corpus, they have the rights to appear before a trial, all of these things, right to an attorney. It's all for them, okay? And that was an important move. Now, 2 years later, in 1870, the 15th Amendment is passed because the only way, and I say this again and again and again, the only way to produce real change in this country is not a protest, it's not all these things. You've got to petition the government to change things. That's the only way it happens, okay? We have the Constitution. We can't just set it aside and go, oh, it's invalid. Anyway, the 15th Amendment allowed African American males to be able to vote. Now, no women of any race at this point. That didn't happen until 1919. Also in 1870, Hiram Revels becomes the first African American senator, and he was from the state of Mississippi. That's where he represented. He was actually from North Carolina. So a lot of people saw this as a token move, basically telling the American government, hey, look, we have somebody of this other race representing us. Don't come down here and see what's going on. Just stay up there and do your own thing. Because what had actually been going on was disenfranchisement. Now, if you remember, disenfranchisement means to discourage someone from an activity. In this case, they want to discourage them from voting. And there were 3 methods. We have a poll tax. Basically, if you can't pay, you can't vote. We have a literacy test. If you can't, I don't want to say read, because we looked at this in class. But basically, if you can't pass this test, that's better, you can't vote. And lastly, and probably the most insidious, because there was no way around it, was the grandfather clause, meaning whatever status your grandfather had in life, you had that exact same status. So that's kind of chaotic. Now, 1892, we see the emergence of Ida B. Wells, who can be called a muckraker if we want to. And she is going to bring up, through her book, Southern Horrors, the Lynch Law in all its phases. Lynching, if you remember, was intimidation, often leading to death, to scare African Americans into their place. And at this point here that we're looking at, it is not illegal to do this. I know that's kind of crazy, just saying that how can you beat somebody or kill somebody, but that's how it worked. And so she begins to write about all these lynchings that had occurred, and the ultimate goal is to get an anti-lynch law, which doesn't happen here. She's actually chased from Mississippi up to Chicago. We went through that already. Now, 1895 sees the mass production of sharecropping. And if you remember, sharecropping was basically a financial form of slavery. You're not bound to the land anymore, but you're bound by a contract you signed, and you're bound by finances. And if you can't fulfill that, you have to pay it back. It's called debt peonage. Basically, you're a peon, you're a slave because of your debt. And sharecropping actually produces this perpetual, never-ending cycle of poverty, which many families in the South cannot get out of. So, while there, we meet the people who want to produce real change. The first man is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington said, "No man can proceed, can produce, until it has learned there's much dignity in tilling a field as riding a pony." He's going to bring back up vocational training, tilling a field. He's going to bring up gradualism, little by little, and he's also going to produce the Tuskegee Institute. And so Southern whites actually love this man because he's not wanting to break the status quo or the way things were established. He simply wants to kind of move forward. Okay? In 1896, we have a massive court case. You remember the Black Codes. One of the Black Codes said that you could not ride in the same railroad car. So, in 1896, Homer Plessy will sue the owner of the separate railroad cars, Mr. Ferguson, and they decided here that they could have this because the letter of the law said, the 14th Amendment said equal protection of the law. They said, we're doing that. No big deal. So, this is the establishment of the separate but equal doctrine, and this is the idea that you could have separate facilities based on race so long as you made sure they were equal. Now, they had no problem making these separate facilities. However, the equality part was definitely not working. Okay? Now, the different types of segregation, the first off, well, we have them both here. We have de jure segregation. I like to go with that one first because that's the one that's no longer around. And de jure segregation is segregation enforced by law, and this could actually, you could go to jail, something like that. This is the Jim Crow laws. Okay, these are Jim Crow laws, and you could actually go to jail for misbehaving or not obeying a curfew or a separate law. And with the Brown versus Board and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, these are struck down. The other type of segregation is de facto segregation. De facto segregation is by custom or tradition, and it's just, why when you go in the cafeteria do you see all of one race at a table together? And it's just been ingrained in their culture that this is comfortable to do. And maybe that is definitely a problem in our society today, because there's an inherent need to want to separate ourselves just because it's the way we've been taught. Now, Jim Crow laws, as I mentioned, are different than the Black Codes. The Black Codes were simply kind of, you had to do this. Jim Crow is, you definitely have to do this or you will go to jail. So if a black man went into a white restroom or a white restaurant or anything like that, they could and would be arrested. If they were protesting and marching, they could be arrested. And that definitely, we see that going on in a lot of different things, okay? Now, in 1910, we have the first Great Migration. lasting until about 1920. This is where the people in uh, the South had had enough of Jim Crow, of lynching, and they began to migrate up to the North in search of not freedom, because remember, separate but equal is still the law of the land. Now, there's no Jim Crow, but they still have to go by the separate but equal doctrine. Marian Anderson showed us a real good example of that. But it's a little bit more tolerant, understanding, and they're looking for jobs. They're looking for money. And so industrialization had been the name of the game, and they're going to fill these factory spots. Also up here around this time, 19 teens, W.B. Du Bois hits the scene. W.B. Du Bois became very critical of Booker T. Washington and his gradualism strategy. He writes many books. One was called The Talented Tenth, which we discussed. He also had The Crisis magazine. He believes that achieving equal rights can only happen by getting African Americans to go to high school and graduate, and go to college and graduate, and then using the court system and higher education to prove that this stuff just doesn't work. It's not going to work. Okay, so he's associated with that thing. So the two men kind of contrast in that light. Now, he will be one of the founding members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Their big goal, it's right there. They want to stop lynching. They want to build democracy in the early 1920s, more or less. Now, in a weird twist of fate, and I brought this up before, it actually did happen through the courts, not through vocational training, but it did happen over time. So a combination of the two, true compromise, that's what our country is built on. And that's kind of interesting that happened like that. Now, in 1914, this is the first time we hear of Marcus Garvey. He becomes really popular in the 1920s due to the Harlem Renaissance, etc. Marcus Garvey is going to help to establish what is called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and this was a black nationalist group promoting the ideas that it is okay to be proud of who you are, and don't shy away from it, don't try to change it, don't try to assimilate it, be proud, and this is perfectly fine. Now, the highlight, if you will, of the black nationalist movement in Harlem in the 1920s is the Back to Africa movement. Certain people wanted to go back to Africa, to their homeland, and they're going to take up Marcus Garvey, and he had a steamship line, he had a newspaper. We've discussed all these things prior. And they want to go back to Liberia, which had been established as a kind of a slave refuge for following the Civil War. Now, a lot of people didn't. And remember, Garvey got into some financial trouble, and he's actually deported from this country. He's sent to Jamaica. There we go. Now, also in the 1920s, we have the Harlem Renaissance. You see here the Harlem Renaissance was about pride. It was about racial empowerment. It was artists. It was writers. It was music. It was culture. It was the flowering or the growth of all these things where people saw that beyond a race, if you will, and said, man, that's some good writing. Man, that's some good music. Man, that's a really good actor. And once we take that label off and realize it's all kind of basically the same thing, we're really productive as a society. Now, the 1920s, because of that music of the Harlem Renaissance, is also known as the Jazz Age, and this is empowering to African American musicians because the best jazz singers happen to be African American. Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway and all these people that we discussed way in the 1920s. All right, like I said, I'm trying to go quick. Last thing about this one here, and before we move into the 1930s, in 1929, Oscar de Priest is the first African American senator selected from a northern state. And I bring this up a ton because people say, well, there was no discrimination in the North, and that's inherently wrong. If there was, why did they wait from 1868 when they could be elected to be a senator all the way until 1929? And that is, there's still a little bit of this ingrained de facto segregation that we have to get past. Like I said, this was all review. Hopefully you'll pick some things out. But the next video civil rights number 2 is where we start picking up on some new things. And hopefully you can see the groundwork later for you. All right?